More, man. Well, we're going to dive more into Madden Faremo and his commitment and his signing and what it means for this class. But Brian, let's take a look at this class overall. You had mentioned that it was already a really good recruiting class, and then Notre Dame made a good push at the end. So let's dive into what some of your initial thoughts are on the 2025 recruiting class. Now that I believe all of the players that they
Yeah.
had and committed have signed.
Yeah, because Josiah Kia signed a couple hours ago. He was the last one that's going to sign because the way it works is you can't officially send in your paperwork till 7 a.m. where you live. So he's in Hawaii time. So I don't think he could commit until I think noon, 1 o'clock. I'm not sure what the difference is in Hawaii, but that's why Chris Burgess and Joseph Reif and guys like that didn't sign until 8 a.m. Eastern, and that's why Creed Thomas didn't sign till 9 a.m. Eastern.
Yeah.
It's because he's in Mountain Time as out in Phoenix. So that's pretty much how it works. Just overall class, Trevor, it's another strong class for Marcus Freeman. I think adding Madden Faremo allows you to now say this defensive class can stack up with any that they've landed the last couple of years. I don't think the offensive class is quite there yet, and we'll talk more about that. But just overall, you added depth to the class, you added impact talent to the class, and you hit some holes. You filled up some holes with impact talent and depth at some very important positions. Like right now, if you look at Notre Dame's roster, the starting cornerback position has been a strength this year, all season. The starting safety position this year has been a strength all season, right? I mean, just is. But the problem is the depth wasn't there. And that's why Christian Gray runs an interception back 100 yards, and they have to put him right back on the field. And instead of giving him if Benjamin Morrison was still healthy and he picked that off, and you had Leonard Moore, you had Christian Gray, I promise you Benjamin Morrison would have come off the field, or Christian Gray would have come off the field, and Leonard Moore would have stepped in and taken those reps if there weren't the injuries, or whoever those depth players. Jaden Mickey would have come in that instance and played had he not quit the team. There's no depth. And safety is another position that needed an influx of talent. So, like when you look at how it's about, there's two things you got to do, Trevor, really to be successful in recruiting, and it really comes down to this. And I don't care where the players are from, but it comes down to this: like adding a top linebacker from California does not make this class better than it would have been if you'd added a comparable player from Indiana or Illinois or Kentucky or Ohio. It's the talent's the one that matters. But they did get a kid from California. But it looks, you look at it and say, okay, did you meet your depth needs? Did you meet your numbers needs? Are you going to come up short? Because one of the issues that we had with the way recruiting went before Marcus Freeman, and this isn't a shot at Brian Kelly, this is also true during the Charlie Weiss era and the Ty Willingham era. This has been an issue for a long time, is they would have one of two mistakes. One is they would just strike out completely in certain spots. Like there was a year under Kelly where Notre Dame did not sign a single receiver. Another year where they signed two receivers and neither of them ended up staying at receiver. There were other years where you remember in 2015, they signed 4 defensive tackles. It was, I think, Jerry Tillery, Micah Treadway, Brandon Tiassam, and Elijah Taylor. Yeah. And they only signed one defensive end in Bo Wallace. And then he got basically his admissions was revoked. So they signed they were already short with him. And then you got in 2016 and you signed this great defensive end class. You get Dalen Hayes and Khalid Kareem and Julian Akwara and Jameer Jones and Adi Takumba Ogundeji, and you signed 0 defensive tackles. Right? Like that's the stuff we would see all the time. Or you'd sign a couple running backs, but they weren't that good. You know, I mean, I love Sebo Flemister and Jameer Smith, but they weren't Notre Dame caliber backs.
Right.
And for a while, that was kind of what was going on with Notre Dame in this class as well, but they were able to finish that one strong. In this class, really, Trevor, as I look at it, there's not a single position now that they got for Ramo where you were short on numbers. Not one. And you can say, well, I don't like receiver recruiting. All right, cool. We'll get to that. But right now, if you look at it from a number standpoint, you signed 3 receivers. That was the minimum number you could be okay with, especially now in the portal era. They wanted 4. They would have taken 5. But 3 was the number that they had to get to, so they met their numbers needs. And then you evaluate, okay, but did they land impact talent? Well, that's the second part of the equation. At that particular position, and again, we'll get into it more. I'm just using an example. It's, okay, you met your numbers, good job, but you didn't get to the impact talent that you needed. And that's the 2 ways of evaluating classes. And when I look at this, Notre Dame graded out well at every single position in regard to hitting their numbers. They hit their minimum numbers everywhere, and that's why you got this 25-man class. Now, did they get as big of a class as they wanted? No, they wanted to get up to 27, 28. But they wanted to add one more D lineman, didn't get it done. Wanted to add another receiver, didn't get it done. There was a couple tight ends they sniffed around, and one they passed on, one they ended up not getting. They couldn't take him. He had some academic issues. But you still met your minimum numbers needs. And that's why they didn't, like when they missed on the last couple receivers, they didn't kind of panic and go after some new guys because they're like, we're not going to add guys, just add guys. We'll go to the portal and try to do this again next year in 2026. And so that's the thing is impact talent. You landed several impact talent players. You landed depth work at all the places you needed it. And that's something to be kind of fired up about, Trev. And as I'm breaking down the class, if you want to talk about my grades and regarding to impact talent, Notre Dame landed 1 5-star player in Will Black. They landed two top 50 players, in my opinion, in Jadon Blair and Dallas Golden. And then they landed other top 100 players. Anthony Sack is a top 100 player. Mark Zachary is a top 100 player. James Flanagan's a top 100 player on my board. Chris Burgess is a top 100 player. I have not finished my grades for Madden for Ramo. He was on the cusp of top 50, but I've got to go through and watch his latest senior film. So I didn't do that this weekend because I didn't think they were going to get him. And so, but he was on the verge. He was right outside top 50 off junior film. And I watched his senior film today again, just some highlights, not actual film. And I'll be surprised if he doesn't jump into top 50 when I'm done with it, but he's not officially there yet. So that's impact talent. So 30-year class graded out as top 100 players or better. And then there's a couple other guys that are in that top 150 range. I actually have Nolan James in the top 150 range at running back. I love Nolan James. So I have Cree Thomas as a top 150 player who had great senior film. He's borderline top 100 on my board. And, and then there's a lot of top 250 caliber guys. And so it's a strong class. There are positions where you wish they could have been a little bit better, but even those positions are still good. They're just not elite. And we'll flush that out a little bit more when we get into the grades for the class.
Yeah, the biggest thing that stands out to me if I'm looking at this class overall is Notre Dame went and addressed what they needed to your point, Bryan, from a numbers standpoint. You go and you look and they signed 7 defensive backs, 4 safeties, 3 corners. And then you look at how that relates to this team this year. Am I incorrect on that?
6 defensive backs.
I have Dallas Golden, Mark Zachary, Cree Thomas, Jadon Blair, Anthony Saka, Ethan Long, Brandon Logan.
Anthony Sack is a linebacker.
Oh, okay. Okay. I didn't know if they were bringing him in for safety or if it was another
he's a linebacker. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Sounds good. So regardless, 6 defensive backs, and you go and you look at the state of the union in Notre Dame's defensive back room right now, and you could make the argument that it is extremely top heavy because there's not a whole lot of depth behind it right now. And so you look at who's coming in there. So you look at things like that. You're going to have 3 transfer portal wide receivers that are leaving that are all seniors in Bo Collins, Chris Mitchell, and Jaden Harrison. And then you're going to replenish that with 3 wide receiver recruits that are coming in. I know we're going to dive into that a little bit later. And then, of course, they're remaining and keeping the trenches built up and signing probably – I don't know from a number standpoint what their goal was for offensive linemen. It's already an extremely deep room as it is right now, especially going into 2025. But they had 4 good offensive linemen, and you said that they wanted to add an additional defensive lineman as well.
Yeah, like they wanted a higher level impact guy.
Yeah.
They weren't going to add a guy just to add a guy. They felt they needed another impact player and came very close with Jalen Wiggins. It just came down to it where the relationships at Florida, once they recommitted to that staff, were just too long standing. So that's ultimately why they ended up not getting him. But they were close. But it doesn't matter if you're close. Close, almost getting a guy doesn't equal sacks for your team. Doesn't equal tackles for loss. And, so like when you look at overall kind of the things that you like about the class, Trevor, I think it's a phenomenal defensive class as a whole. I think it's an excellent offensive line class. I like the backfield pickups, especially after what you got last year. Getting a kid like Nolan James to follow up with Keedron Young and Aeneas Williams. Getting a kid like Blake Hebert to follow up with, from CJ Carr, I really like. You got an elite tight end. You haven't signed an elite tight end in a few years. You've signed good tight ends, but not an elite tight end. And so that was obviously big. And the secondary class is as good as I've seen at Notre Dame since Lou Holtz is the head coach. I mean, it's not even close. This is an elite class. And you're looking at the linebacker class and you're like, you signed 2 top 100 kids.
Yeah.
And then there's one kid, Josiah Key, I just don't have a strong opinion on yet because there's so little film. So I kind of have an incomplete grade on him right now because there's just not a lot of film. A lot of what I feel about him is more relaying what people I know and trust are telling me. I have someone that coaches out in Hawaii that I know really well. Talked to him this morning again about Josiah. Said great motor, plays hard, can run, smart, all those type of things. But there's just not a lot of film for me to say I'm super fired up about him. But I know Notre Dame's excited about him and has been for a while. And then you land the 2 top 100 kids. So there's just a lot of really strong aspects of the class. And then you talk about the things that aren't going to grade out as high. And we'll get into more specifics when we get into the grades, Trev. But when I look at this class, receiver should have been better, could have been better. There's no question. I grade Elijah Burris and Scrap Richardson out as top 250 players, 4-star top 250 players. And I'm going to have a section here in a second where I'm going to talk about my biggest risers in the class. And Jerome Bettis Jr. is one of my biggest risers in the class. I liked his senior film. But you're Notre Dame. You can't have your best receivers in the class be top 250 because those are good football players. I'm glad they're coming to Notre Dame. They can play at Notre Dame. The comparison that I made with Elijah Burris is kind of like he's like a Ladd McConkey type, where not quite as fast, but similar. We're just great route runner, not the biggest guy. He's not going to put up 1,000 yards and just dominate, but he's just going to be a good football player and a guy that you're like, you can't guard that guy. He may not be running a million goal balls and post routes in college, but he's just a really good football player. But Ladd McConkey needed Brock Bowers. He needed I'm drawing a complete blank on the kid that went to Texas.
A.D. Mitchell.
A.D. Mitchell. Yeah, I was going to say Thomas. I was like, no, that's not right. He needed those dynamic weapons around him. You think of a sort of like a different role, but like you think of that really good Clemson team back in 2016 or 2018, I should say, where you had a really dynamic receiving core with Justin Ross and T. Higgins, and everybody remembers Hunter Renfrow, but everybody forgets about Amari Rodgers, who had 55 catches for 575 yards and 4 touchdowns. Now, Amari Rodgers and Elijah Burris are different style of players. The comp isn't as them as styles. It's more of, you've got to have your studs, but you need that number 2, number 3, number 4 type of guy that are really good football players. And that's what they signed in this class. And so the issue that I have is you look at it and say, and again, it drives me crazy sometimes. I'm making a comparison of the role that they would fit. I'm not saying they're direct comparisons as players. There's a difference. But you still need that number 1, that dude, right, that guy, and they didn't get that at receiver in this class. And you say, yeah, but they were a great team this year. That I understand all that, but you want it just because Michigan won without a number 1 receiver. Fine, that's great, but I would rather have one. And you're even better imagine if you have a great O-line and a great quarterback and great running backs and great tight ends and then you also land a stud receiver. That's where they need to get to. Those are the aspects that they're getting a lot of really good number 2s and a lot of good number 3s and good depth players. But they're not getting that number 1 guy. You got Cam Williams last year. Even the year before, I love Jaden Greathouse, love Jordan Faison, but they're not that dude.
Yeah.
They're not Will Fuller. They're not Michael Floyd. They're not Golden Tate. They're not that guy. And that's what's missing from this class. You talk about the biggest list, right? They're not getting those guys. And some of you, I know that Will Fuller wasn't that coming in. But I'm not going to assume that someone is going to be him if we don't evaluate it that way. So I can only evaluate what we know. And what we know looking at this class is they did not get that type of player. Does somebody want to try to tell me that Elijah Burris or or I'm not even gonna go. I'm not gonna let people distract me today. It just drives me crazy sometimes. Like I understand it. Did you think? Let me calm down. Just kills me, So, but anyway, Trev, there's not that kind of guy in this class. There's good what's happened in the receiver class is you have some people that are just going to always turn everything into a positive and say, and then there's other people that are going to say, oh, it sucks. It's not good. You can't win. I'm like, okay, neither of those are factual. It's in the middle. It's a good receiver class. Scrap Burgess is a good player. Elijah Burst is a good player. Jerome Bettis is ascending. But it's not a class that you're going to say, we're going to beat Alabama, we're going to beat LSU, we're going to beat Clemson, we're going to beat Ohio State, we're going to beat Texas. You're going to beat those teams because of your wide receivers, based on what we see of the class. Could some guys end up being better than we think? Sure, I guess. I don't know what I would have graded Will Fuller out coming out of high school because I didn't evaluate that class because I was coaching that year. But I had a buddy of mine who thought that he was the best pickup in that class. So some people thought that. There's a reason why Notre Dame flipped him from Penn State. But there's nobody that you look at and say, like Leonard Moore. I gave Leonard Moore a 4.5-star upside grade as a top 50 player. And I said, if he would have played more of a senior year, he probably would have got a 5-star upside grade. You had Benjamin Morrison as a top 100 player. You can evaluate guys that aren't ranked high by other people and say, no, that's a dude. And none of those guys grade out that way. Good football players, but they're not that. And that's what's missing. And then the same thing on the D line. This is a good defensive line class. You got depth, you got some size. Love Christopher Burgess, but there's no guy that I look at and say, that guy's Bryce Young, or that guy's going to be Boubacar, or that guy's going to be, that twitchy elite edge rusher. There's some guys that had good senior years. There's some guys I didn't grade real high when they committed that I like a lot better now, which we'll get into when we talk about the risers. But when you look at this group, it's a good class. It's not a class that you're going to say, you're going to go beat Bama. You're going to go beat Georgia, you're going to go beat Texas, you're going to go beat Ohio State, you're going to go beat those teams because of your D-line class. It's not that, right? You got one that could be that, and Chris Burgess, and some other guys that are low floor, high ceiling guys. And is that going to be enough? Well, if you land those type of classes enough back to back, eventually somebody's going to hit, right? But like last year's class and this year's class complement each other well, which we'll dive more into because last 2 years was more about the upside. This year there's a couple guys that have a little bit higher floors, a little bit bigger bodies and things like that. But again, that's another area where I think recruiting can get better at those positions. And outside of that, I was very pleased with this class. Everything else was pretty good to really, really good in this class. And even those two positions though, Trev, those are good classes. They're just, they need to be better. That's going to be the key. And that's what they need to do in 2026.
Yeah, absolutely. You need, starting off from RIP, you need that top end player that you can look at that and say, hey, potentially day one, he comes in and changes what this position group looks like. And I'm with you 100%. And that's not to say that other guys can't develop into it, right? But then you have to go back and you look at some of the other players that were mentioned in the chat or players that you brought up. They weren't those day one guys that came in and changed the landscape of the offense. You know what I mean? Will Fuller didn't come in and have a 1,000-yard receiving year as a true freshman. It's those guys are the Ryan Williams of the world, right? That are going to Alabama and going to have a 1,000-yard receiving season as a true freshman. I guess as a 17-year-old, for those of you who didn't know, say that sarcastically. But I'm with you. I'm with you 100% on where that needs to be. So, Bryan, I think that's going to do it for this part. Getting ready to dive into grades here. But before we move on to the next part here, guys, you know what to do. Hit that like button.
I did want to finish off this overview with the risers and guys who are a little bit down, and then we'll get into the grades after that.
Gotcha.
So I did want, because there are some guys, look, every year when you grade film, there's guys that are better than they were the year before. And not just better, like everybody, usually most guys just get better. It's guys that took big jumps. And so I want to go over a couple guys that I thought took some big jumps this season. And we'll start with offense. And for me, Will Black's a big one. Now, I know a lot of other people had Will Black taking a jump before, but as I said, during the summer, I didn't have any film of Will Black. All I had was highlights. And it's really hard to make a strong, convicted evaluation of a guy when all you really have is highlights as an offensive lineman. Well, in the past month or so, I've been able to get game film of Will Black, and he's a dude. So I had him as a 4-star top 250 guy based off highlights, and that's as much as I can give for an alignment and highlights. And when I got the senior film, he took a huge jump for me, and I now view him as a 5-star player. He graded it. So the way it works, I have it in 8 different spots where I give grades, and it's different for every player. It's specific to the position you play, and he jumped big. So he's a 5-star player. So he's clearly the biggest guy. But another guy, it's not quite a 4-star yet, but he went up. He went from a 3-star to a 3.5-star, which is like top 500 guy to a top 350 type of guy. And that's Jerome Bettis Jr. And when I graded his senior film, I was very pleasantly surprised, Trev, to see what he can do. I mean, he got a lot bigger. You know, he's a really good sized kid. He's a legit 6'2". He's a legit 200 pounds. He's a pretty thickly built kid. He's really developed his body. He was a lot more smooth this year than he was in the past. Last year as a junior, in 14 games, he had 30 catches for 369 yards, 12.3 yards per carry, and 4 touchdowns. This year as a senior, in 12 games, he had 36 catches for 630 yards, 17.5 yards per catch, and 7 touchdowns. And he's also a two-way player that had 47 tackles this year and 2 interceptions and a pass breakup and 2 forced fumbles. So he's a two-way player, and I love two-way players. You know that. And so before I said, look, I didn't hide the fact that he's not a Notre Dame caliber player. He's not. Watching his senior film, and I called a couple buddies of mine who are really good film evaluators and said, hey, give me your opinion of this kid. Didn't tell them what I thought. I said, just you watch the senior film. What do you think? And they were both said the same thing I did. Like, he got a lot better. Is he an impact guy? No, he's not. But I'll tell you this, after watching his senior film, Trev, and I'll break it down a little bit more in the receiver part, but he became a guy that I'm happy Notre Dame took now. Because I'm like, look, can he do what Jaden Thomas has done for Notre Dame after watching the senior film? Yeah. Before, he's going to be a great depth guy, maybe grows into an H-back. Maybe. Now you look at him and say, this guy can help you at some point down the road. And if he gets a little faster, even more so. So that's kind of where I saw. So when I watched that senior film, I was very encouraged by that. Those are the 2 guys on offense that I thought were the biggest risers of what they were before. That doesn't include Blake Hebert, doesn't include Nolan James, guys, Scrap Richardson, guys that they signed, because I only have the one grade of them, senior year film grade of them. This is guys that were previously committed. Defensively, a guy that I'm a lot higher on now than when he signed, this is the biggest riser for me defensively, is Dominic Hulak. I was not a fan of Dominic Hulak when they got him. I thought he was a nice, solid depth player, can play a lot of different positions, can help you out a little bit. Didn't love him, to be honest with you. Didn't understand why they passed on some other guys to take him. I still think there's some other guys they should have got, but I really liked his senior film, Trev. Put on some good weight, got more explosive, a little bit more twitchy off the edge, more comfortable playing off the edge because he played a lot of off-ball linebacker. As a junior and sophomore, plays running back at times for Immaculate Conception, which is the name of his high school. He was a guy that I had as a 3.5-star player, a top 350 to 400 kind of guy, solid, good depth player. He's now a 4-star top 250 guy on my board. And it's not just me too. I know that at least one of the recruiting services also jumped him up to a 4-star top 250 guy. And I talked to some people in the Chicago area, and a lot of people were blown away with the jump he made. So it's not just me that felt that way. So he definitely impressed me a lot with his senior film, Trevor. He was a big riser for me. Another guy, and I already liked him more than anybody else anyway, like the national services, but another guy that had a really good senior year is Cree Thomas. He was really good. Now, I had him as a top, like 150, borderline top 250 guy. When he committed to Notre Dame, after breaking down his senior film, he's a borderline top 100 guy. He's not quite there yet, but he's close. And he's now closer in points to 100 than he is to 150, to like the 250 range. You know what I mean? So he's still in that 150 range, but he went up as well. And so that was a really, really big jump for him. Loved. You just want to see that confirmation. And the other thing too is he played mostly safety as a junior. So it was a lot of projecting him to corner. He played a lot more corner as a senior. So you could see him flip his hips. You could see him, play. And he actually played a lot more at the line of scrimmage than Benjamin Morrison did. Not that he's better at it. It's just they allowed him to do it more where they didn't ask. Benjamin, they used their corners back then. I don't know if there's been a change in defensive coordinator, but they used him to play a lot of off man, and he was great at it. And he would play some press, but not as much. They did a little bit more with that with Cree, and he looked really good. He looked really smooth, could flip his hips because he's a little bit of a high cut kid, real long legs. And those guys at times can be a little tight. And that's what we talked about with the Cam Hart. And that's what makes Cam Hart and Leonard more special, is because they're those 6'2" kids that are a lot cleaner athletically, a lot smoother athletically than a lot of 6'2" athletes. Cree is over 6'1". He's about 6'1". Notre Dame listed him at 6 foot. I've seen him stand next to other guys they listed at 6 foot, and he's taller than they are. And they had him at 179. So my bet is that was his measurement when he was on campus 2 years ago, and not an updated measurement, because they had him, I think, about the same size as Mark Zachary. I've seen him and Mark Zachary next to each other. They're not the same height, nor are they the same size. But Cree had a really good senior year, so he went up on it for me, and which just makes what I already felt was the best cornerback class Notre Dame assigned since Lou Holtz was here. The only other class that could even come close to it was the Troy Pride, Dante Vaughn, and Julian Love class in 2016. And it got even better with how good Mark Zachary was and how good Cree Thomas was, and y'all know that I already loved Dallas Golden. So he was another big riser. And then Brandon Logan had a great senior year. I mean, Trev, I know you got a chance to see a little bit of him this year if you want to add to that, but he was just kind of a downhill thumper, just a really good athlete. He looked more like a football player this year. Just clean transitions, physical, explosive, and a big-time playmaker. If you want to add a little bit about what you saw from Brandon Logan, because I saw your face when I started talking about Brandon Logan, you want to add some thoughts into that. I thought he got a lot better as a senior.
Yeah, I have a couple friends that live up in Fort Wayne who, when Brandon Logan committed, they were familiar with the high school that he went to, and so that's kind of when he caught my eye, and I started looking at him a little bit. And during his junior year, you're right, he was very much just kind of a straight downhill guy, not as smooth of an athlete. And his senior year, he evolved into a really good football player and somebody that's really going to contribute in the defensive backfield. But you're right. I mean, he's one of those guys that just kind of has a nose for the football. You know what I mean? Like he's always in the right spot at the right time. He is developed a lot better in coverage. So I like the addition, man. I'm glad that you put him on your risers list, because he was somebody that when I watched his junior year film, I was like, okay,
Right.
like
you see some tools.
Yeah.
He was more of an athlete than a football player. Did you feel that way?
Yep.
I mean, he was just kind of a downhill, really fast. He looked like a really athletic baseball player trying to play football.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But you saw some tools. But
yeah. It was going to be one of those where if his senior year film reflected what his junior year was, it was like maybe that, staff sees a good foundation to build on, that they're going to evolve him into a football player. And it looks a lot like Brandon Logan kind of took a lot of that upon himself, and he developed into a really good football player his senior year. Yep, he did, which was really exciting.
So those are my biggest risers. I mean, there's a lot of other guys that improved as seniors, right? I mean, Anthony Sacca, solidified some things. He got better as a senior. Matty Augustine, even though he missed a little bit of time, he continues to get better. We didn't get a chance to see Gordy Solfstead. He was injured, so he did. Christopher Burgess got better. He went from a top 150 guy on my board to a top 100 guy, but it wasn't a huge jump. He was kind of right outside top 100 anyway. He just had more of a natural junior to senior year growth. He even played some middle linebacker for them. That I would not have wanted to be on the other side of the field and watching Chris freaking Burgess standing at middle linebacker on the other side of the field.
Yeah,
that would have not been fun. Owen Strebig made just normal. And if you guys like watching a offensive line film, his high school puts out almost all their games online. You can actually watch his games, which are always way better for evaluating offensive linemen. So if you go online and I think it was a Waukesha, right?
Yeah,
Waukesha Memorial.
Yeah,
I think we said like Waukesha or something like that. And somebody was like, you got that wrong. It's Waukesha. I was like, okay, my bad. But like other guys, like Elijah Burris got better as a senior, but not like I already liked him more than most anyway. You know what I mean? Like, so he was already there. But most of those guys were just normal junior to senior improvement. And I only really had three guys that I I don't want to call them that they were descenders, but they didn't have the jumps that I hoped that they would have as seniors. Trev, and there's 3 guys in that category. Actually, the only guy on offense that I was really disappointed in a senior film, and I hate saying this because he's not in the class anymore, and I feel kind of bad. Like I love the kid, great family. Justin Thurman just never took that jump as a player. He's a really explosive athlete, but he just never took that jump as a player, and just didn't become like that Notre Dame caliber back that I thought he could become.
Sure.
And so he was a guy that you understood what. Now, just so people understand, Notre Dame did not drop him. They did drop Daniel Anderson. Notre Dame's told Justin Thurman, if you want to stay in the class, you can. But they had the same evaluation I did. He just didn't improve. And they said it's going to have a tough time playing here. And because they loved the kid and respected it, they had the room for him. They said, we're going to honor your commitment. But we're just letting you know we do love you. And you may want to think about going somewhere else where you're going to have a better shot to play. And he ended up going to Kansas. So I was really happy with him. Somebody just said Daniel Anderson signed with Northwestern. I love that for that kid. Love that kid. He's one of the best young men you're ever going to meet in the recruiting process. And actually, I got to know him and his family a little bit better after he decommitted because of some of the comments. But you talk to Ryan, talk maybe the cover of the kid's commitment. It's first-class young man, just a first-class young man. But him and Justin Thurman are now at schools that are better fits for them, where they can actually have a shot to play. And so that's a position where I thought Notre Dame upgraded bigly, in my opinion. You like that, bigly?
I do.
But there were 3 players that I thought had, I don't say not disappointing senior seasons, but just didn't make the jumps that I thought they would, and their grade went down a little bit. Davion Dixon is one. I thought as he got bigger and bigger and bigger, he got a little bit more stiff. He's a big, strong kid. He's got a really nice first step, but his lateral movement just kind of regressed a little bit. He's still a quality player. I mean, it's still a good pickup. He's still a guy you put in there that knows that one technique or play that zero technique. Or if you want to go odd, he's a guy that if you want to do mix up some odd fronts and maybe drop your Viper, he's a guy that can line up over the center and play, that zero technique. He didn't have the athletic improvements that I thought he would have. And actually, I think he's a little less athletic now than he was as a sophomore when he committed. Still a good football player. Still glad they got him. But he just didn't have the rise that I thought he was going to have. His grade actually went down a little bit on my board. Joseph Reif's another one. Just evaluating his frame this summer. He doesn't have the frame I hoped he would have or thought he had watching film. I don't know that he's got the frame to grow into a 3 technique now, which makes him more of a pure edge player. Still a good player, high motor, solid athlete. Seeing him this summer, watching his senior film, his grade went down a little bit for me. He's no longer a top 250 guy. He's a little bit outside of that now. Still happy with the pickup, still a good player, but his ceiling is really what kind of came down a little bit for me in my evaluation of him. Still like the floor, still like a lot of the tools. Very productive high school player. Just the projection's not quite as clean as I had hoped it would be and thought it would be initially. And then another guy, he's still a heck of a football player, and he still grades out as a 4-star player. But for me, I was hoping that Ethan Long would get a little bit more burst as a senior, from a speed standpoint, and he didn't really take that jump. Really good instincts, tough kid, smooth kid, but just still doesn't have that top-level speed that you want from like that high-level safety type of player. I'm still hoping that comes at some point in time at Notre Dame. And I still like him. He still can play at Notre Dame. He can be a rotation guy at Notre Dame, a starter down the road at Notre Dame. Still love all that. I just was hoping that he'd take a little bit more of a jump as a senior, get a little bit more explosive as a senior, and he just didn't do that. So those are the 3 guys whose grades are either stayed put or went down a little bit after senior film, and you compare that to the risers. So that's my risers and kind of fallers a little bit because you're always if you go through a class and you don't have anybody that just didn't quite have the senior you hoped for, either A, you've got the Irish colored glasses on or whatever color your school plays for, or B, the recruiting staff was perfect, and nobody is. Every class is going to have those, and so again, none of those guys that are still in the class are like, man, they shouldn't offer that kid. None of those are like that. Those guys are no longer in the class anymore. They just didn't quite have the jump that I hoped that they would be.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess To bounce it back to you, I do have a quick question before we move on to the next segment. So out of all the 25 signees that they had, is there a guy on here that from their junior year to senior year that you think, flew under the radar? I know you talked about your biggest risers, but out of maybe it could be out of those or somebody else. But is there anybody that you thought might not have gotten the recognition that they deserve nationally that are now just playing at a much higher level than what you anticipated after their senior year?
That maybe the national people are starting to recognize? Yeah, I mean, some of those guys that I talked about are actually starting to get a little bit more recognition nationally. Not all of them, because I think what happens with some of these recruiting services, Trevor, is they get an opinion on a guy that commits early and then they just don't reevaluate him. And it's unfortunate, but they just don't reevaluate those players. So I don't think Rivals and some of those other recruiting services did any kind of reevaluation of Elijah Burris. I don't think they did that at all. I think some of these recruiting services that still have Dom Hulak as a 3-star player, I just don't think they reevaluated him. I think they just had their evaluation and there was no need to change it. Some did. And so like Elijah Burris, for example, was a consensus 3-star recruit, very low 3-star recruit, by the way, when he committed to Notre Dame. And for example, he was a 247, had him as and they're the worst rankings of them all, but I got to give credit where credit is due. He was a number 411 player in the country coming into the fall, and they jumped him up all the way to in the top 240. So obviously that's not too far behind where I have him. You look at a guy like Dom Hulak, who was a consensus 3-star recruit. He's now a 4-star on Rivals, which is a jump. And now on 3 now has him as the number 279 player in the country. I don't know if they'll drop him or not out, but they started to kind of show a little bit of recognition for what he can do. Some of the other guys still, not getting the love. I mean, Cree Thomas still isn't getting the respect that he deserves. And then a couple others obviously started already getting that push. I mean, Will Black, I was actually the last person to give Will Black that jump just because I didn't have any good film of him.
Sure.
And so, and I'm not making an evaluation off of an offensive lineman based on what he did in a non-padded camp. I needed to see film.
Right.
But he obviously is there. And so those are the guys that are starting to get a little bit more national attention. Some of the Notre Dame guys, like Rivals, dropped Jadon Blair out of their top 300. And I told a guy there, I was like, dude, you guys are gonna regret that big time, going to regret that. But no, nobody else is getting really that was flying under the radar before is getting that outside of the guys that I just talked about. It's a good question.
Gotcha. Well, sounds good, man. Well, now I think it is time to move on to the next section where we talk through and we grade each individual position in the 2025 signee class. But before we do that, you guys know the drill. Make sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you know when Irish Breakdown goes live so you can stay in the now. And be sure to share this podcast with friends, family, anybody that you know loves Notre Dame as much as you do. And of course, be sure to go to boards.irishbreakdown.com. That's where we have all of our exclusive content coming out. That's where you can stay the most up to date with everything happening Notre Dame. So make sure you go to boards.irishbreakdown.com.